Hi, I'm John Stevens,
This is Matt Russell.
and this is Pod Have Mercy.
This is Pod Have Mercy.
Well, today we are blessed to have Michael Sciretti and Peter Johns. And for those who are familiar with Chapelwood, you're going to know about the Center for Christian Spirituality, which was formed, Peter, 17, 18 years ago?
Maybe 19.
Yes.
19 years ago when Jerry Weber came to Chapelwood. We've had Jerry on the podcast. And the Center for Christian Spirituality, why don't you guys tell folks, Michael Sciretti is our pastor in our contemplative community and the director there, and Peter Johns is also very tied into all that, not only with the worship and the music and the composing, but also the teaching and the formation. And why don't you guys just let people know what is the Center for Christian Spirituality first, and then we'll kind of go with today. Because I think, there's so much going on in the world with the pandemic and economic issues and race that I thought today to talk about mental and psychological and spiritual well-being would be a really great topic of need. Mm-hmm. So let's start with Center for Christian Spirituality.
Yeah. Well, the Center for Christian Spirituality is a community of people who we're all seeking some kind of deepening connection with God that makes a difference in who we are with God and with ourselves and with other people and with all of creation. And so we help guide people into what's been called the contemplative dimension of Christianity, or the inner dimension of Christianity, transformation from the inside out, so to speak. And so this is a very timely topic for us in these times that we find ourselves in, and how can we be a more centered presence for ourselves, but for the people that are around us.
Yeah, and so the way we do that, probably the way most people encounter the center for the first time is through our Sunday morning contemplative worship service, which features a lot of silence, a lot of space. There's never any sermon. There might be some brief meditation and some directed questions for reflection. So we offer that, and that becomes a real doorway into the center for various people. And then we also do various different small groups, study groups, those kinds of things as well, geared around different topics. So that's really the two main areas that we're involved in.
I've always found it fascinating in the ways that I intersect with it, whether it's a silent day retreat at, is it Martel?
Villa de Martel.
Villa Martel, or a centering prayer, even at the Anchor House, which is next door, where people can come and just learn some prayer practices, ancient prayer practices, and contemplative or spiritual practices that maybe dive in beyond what people are used to. It's always, I know enough about contemplative spirituality to be dangerous. I went on a kick for a while where it was very important for me in a developmental aspect for about 10 years, and I still revisit it when I am kind of lost and need to stop and be grounded. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the Desert Fathers or Merton or Rohr or any of these Keating, that I have to kind of find some reconnection with my center. Mm-hmm. But sometimes the tyranny of the urgent propels us. And that's what I think where we find ourselves now. Is, Covey talks about we get so driven by the urgent that we lose track of what's important. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that is, I want to talk about the traumas and the things that are going on, but I'm also very concerned, and I'd love your thought on this. I'm catching you off guard, I know, but, I have this assumption that the church is becoming the enemy of the Christian. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that when we proclaim the message of Jesus Christ, that is going to confront in profound ways our personal preferences, our partisan ideologies, our worldviews, our culture. And we're going to assume that the church has taken sides in our game. Because, we take sides.
Mm-hmm.
So we're like, oh, the church has taken sides. Well, I guess I can't go to this church anymore because they've taken a side.
Mm.
And my whole thing is, I just want to take Jesus' side, right? That's the side I want to take. And it will confront both sides. But I wonder, is that that mentality of the culture that we're in, where the church is now becoming an enemy? I don't know if I would call it immaturity or a lack of understanding or a lack of biblical literacy or spiritual health or what. I'm just throwing this out there to y'all.
Well, I mean, what
your
comes
thoughts
to
are on that?
my mind immediately is where we get the word contemplative from is actually a Greek word, the Greek word theoria, which is it's a way of seeing. It's a way of beholding. We get the word theory from it, and we think theory is very intellectual. But for theoria, it's more of like kind of a seeing with the eye of the heart. And for me, when we talk about what was Jesus's side, for him it was a way of seeing the world and seeing how other people are embedded in this beautiful but wounded creation. So what's important, for us, I think at the center, is how do we help people see contemplatively, which is to see truly. It's to see to see with more of ourselves. And I think that's part of what happens with the tyranny of the urgent, that it's almost like we shrink somewhere in ourselves, and we maybe get into kind of self-preservation kinds of activities or concerns, which are important, but the danger is that we go into a smaller part of ourselves, and instead of opening ourselves up more and to see, what is in front of me right now. And it's not just the pandemic, it's not just whatever, but there's so much more that's going on in this reality right now. But we get into a small part of ourselves. Luther called it, we get curled up within ourselves. But we're meant to wear our insides out, so to speak, and to live from the heart. And that's a kind of seeing that takes practice. It takes practices, and so I think we're at a very interesting moment where, in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the darkness, there is an opportunity to wake up for those who feel that stir. And that's my hope, that we can be the center, and other people who are trying to do the same kind of work, that how can we see with more of ourselves, and how can we see the world as really as iconic. How can we see this world as an icon of the divine, window of the divine? And when we begin to see from that place, things begin to look differently, and how we behave, how we relate to you as an icon and not an object, or someone in my way.
So explain icon versus object. I don't know that most people would know. I don't know that I fully know. I know what an icon is. But how would you, in layman's terms, flesh that out for people who are listening?
For me, an icon, especially the traditional religious painted icons, they're a window to deeper reflection on self and of God. And so if I view you and Michael as icons, then you're an invitation for me to encounter God afresh. You're a unique expression of who God is, and I'm invited to encounter God through you, through Michael.
And through anything
Yeah.
in creation. I mean, to see it as a unique face of the divine.
Whereas object is...
It's opaque. It's just solid. You're just a material object, not transparent.
One-dimensional.
One-dimensional, yeah. That would be another way of talking about it. It's a way
Easily
of,
defined in
Yeah.
easily defined categories,
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
conservative, liberal,
Yes.
Republican, Democrat,
That's
this,
an-
that.
That's becoming, and the way that some people talk about it in the tradition is to use, we were talking about alchemy earlier before John got here, but transmuting idols into icons.
Yeah.
And an object can become an idol, whether it's your political affiliation or your church or a particular practice. Even coming to church can become an idol.
Yeah, amen. So I get idolatry, big time. The regathering of having church on campus in the sanctuary I get a cultural affinity definition of how we find ourselves, but also I think an idol because we think that's what church is. And that's not what church is.
No.
I mean, I think about what Chapelwood has been doing over the last 3 months, or however long that we've not been meeting on Sunday mornings. And in some ways, we are as engaged, if not more engaged in the world than we've ever been because the need is greater. And so the church is not closed. Building may be closed. Church is not closed. But man, because we're not meeting on Sunday morning, some people think church is just not happening.
Yeah.
And that's just, sometimes I wonder, I've just failed as a pastor.
No, that's not
Just an abject failure for 30 years that people just see the church as being defined as I got to be there in that pew on Sunday morning. That's object, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very much object. So it's interesting. For me, I grew up in a very evangelical conservative church. And so we used a lot of the language.
In South Georgia, I can tell by your language you come from.
No, a little bit further east than that. But we would use the language of inviting Jesus into your heart when you became a Christian. And yet after that, this emotional experience, then faith became intellectual. It was right belief, a series of precepts you were supposed to take on. And for me, during this time of social distance and quarantining, I've had to go right back to, I don't need to go to the sanctuary. I need to realize I am a sanctuary, that Jesus is right here inside, within, and I need to find ways to, go to my inner room and pray that is not dependent on being in a specific building.
Yeah, we talked about it in one of our worship services as Jesus in the post-resurrection time leading up to Pentecost. He's teaching them, I'm only with you a little bit longer, and it's almost like he was working with them as if they had training wheels, so to speak, and they were about to come off. Or the other image we used is that they've been relying on the scaffolding of a building, but when the building is built, you no longer need the scaffolding. And they were coming to a point, once he left after Ascension and before Pentecost, that they needed to be the building and not rely on the scaffolding anymore. And so I think about that in the midst of this. One thing that we told our community at the very beginning when we were having to not meet in person was I felt like we were equipped for this moment. That as a contemplative community, we were equipped for. We'd been talking about practices and going into the interior room and that you are a temple body and it goes wherever you go. And we're in the temple of creation. And so we're equipped for this. And so how can we live into that and live from that kind of perspective and view of ourselves and our world?
Well, one of the things I had some notes I wanted to share with you. I've been just reading about this. Has been of concern to me because we've been thinking about pandemic. All right, now since really early to mid-March, a lot of people have been locked down. A lot of people still are, even though a lot of things are opening up. I've had a lot of emails now that we start talking about regathering of a lot of our older members that said, hey, I'm glad you're regathering, but I'm not coming. And I don't know that they will for a long time. So there's a lot of grief and anguish and struggle and concern. Then you have the economic impact. A lot of people have lost their jobs or lost wealth or struggled with all sorts of things, whether it's family members. And then you get the killing of George Floyd, of course, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. I mean, it's just all these things we've talked about. And the protests for 2 weeks solid in this racial uprising of trying to shine a light on things in our country. And I think about a couple of things that I've read. One is trauma. This is why we have this big TV up here for you. And I just a couple of notes. It's like trauma is often associated with something overtly violent, such as a car accident or a shooting. But this Dutch philosopher Aiden describes a situation as traumatic when it violates familiar expectations about someone's life and world, sending them into a state of extreme confusion and uncertainty. That sounds like exactly what so many people are dealing with. So when you think of trauma, you always think of like this really horrific, horrible thing. But if you just define it as violating the familiar expectations about your life and your world, then wouldn't you think that, like most all of us, are dealing with significant amounts of trauma? The other thing I thought was interesting is this concept, and I mentioned this morning, I think you all were there, about moral injury. And moral injury, it's a term from the military, occurs when a person does something that goes against their deeply held moral beliefs. Now, this would be most obvious in the hospitals in New York, where a doctor had one ventilator and 2 patients. Mm-hmm. And you have to make a decision who gets the ventilator. That causes moral injury because it goes against some moral teaching or something against you that goes against your deeply held moral beliefs. I think, though, that around this whole issue of race, I hear good Christian people saying things that they're parroting or echoing off certain talking points or news channels, that they'll say, what happened to George Floyd was horrible, or what happened in this situation horrible, but look at all this bad stuff. Mm-hmm. And it makes me think, okay, there's a reason we all do that. But deep, deep down, maybe even at a subconscious level, is there some disconnect, some violation of what we know to be moral and right? We know we should say, I know it's wrong what happened to George Floyd, not with a but with a period, and just sit there for a while.
Yeah.
And we don't do that. We move on quickly in a way to deflect the hard work we really need to do. And so I thought it would be good to hear from you guys. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that I think we as Christians really need to do some soul work, some digging, some sitting in the dust with sackcloth and ashes, some lamenting, some prayer. It's one of the reasons why it's been very important for me not to put out these continual statements about things, but just to invite people on a journey of listening and reflection and reading and discovery about just everything. I'm just curious about when it relates to trauma or moral injury or spiritual listening or growth. You guys have shared a little bit, I think, earlier today about some of this. What are your words of encouragement for people as they're dealing with all of these things?
Well, one thing that I'm struck by that definition of trauma, taking his definition of trauma, you can almost see that as an opportunity to transform, because it's upsetting your expectations of how you think the world works or should work, which is not reality, which is not a correct seeing of the world. To kind of go back to what Jesus was doing, Jesus was completely upsetting people's expectations left and right of how the world should work. So in that sense, and this is the difficult piece, but throughout the spiritual traditions, there's a teaching of the dark night, of the darkness, of the black light, of doing the deep soul work that is upsetting and dismantling of the ego, of the lower self. That is just a part of the journey. And at least me, growing up, that wasn't as much communicated to me. It was much more of, develop this personal relationship with Christ, and that might involve baptism and some other different things. But it really, and then, you get your place into heaven, but it wasn't as much that there is this ongoing work of sanctification, to use the Wesleyan term or the Pauline term, ongoing transformation that is going to take you through darkness. It's going to be uncomfortable. The gospel passage that Tammy read this morning about Jesus said he comes to bring a sword. What's all that about? So we kind of gloss over those more difficult passages. But I guess I see this in the light of that this is an opportunity for people to kind of wake up out of how they thought the world worked for them, and to maybe to begin to have something open up inside of us, all of us, that, wait, this is an opportunity to live into a different kind of world, to see a different kind of world, to maybe to co-create a different kind of world. That I at least would say would be more in keeping with the theoria or the vision of Christ.
There is a game that I've often seen at carnivals and at the seafront called WhackaMole. You've seen it where the moles pop up and you have the big mallet and you hit them over the head. And it feels a lot of my life I've played a kind of spiritual whack-a-mole, that things will pop up and, this struggle, this problem, this sin, and I'll start hitting it over the head with his Bible reading, his prayer, his small group, his accountability, and they keep popping up faster and faster, and I just keep hitting them, and I eventually fail, I have a breakdown, I cry at an altar, and then I start playing the game again. And it feels like there's an opportunity, instead of playing the game, to actually open up the cabinet and look at the mechanics that are going on underneath that are causing these things to arise in my life. To use another image, it's like there's so many things that I thought were problems that now I see are more like the warning light on the dashboard of my car. And I'm treating the warning light without getting down and doing the deeper work of treating the problem underneath. And that's what the gift that contemplative spirituality has been for me.
What are some specifics? So let's look at it from different people intersecting it in different ways. You have people who are brand new. They have no idea what contemplative spirituality is. They come to church. They understand prayer as them maybe doing most of the talking and not much of the listening. I'm going off just my own perspective of my young spirituality, the petition prayer, where my prayers are only about what I got to say to God. What do you say to people who are saying, okay, I get the trauma, I get the moral injury, I'm there with all of you on all this stuff. What specifically could I do to begin to examine what's working the whack-a-mole?
Yeah.
One simple practice that we teach a lot at the center is an ancient prayer practice called the Examen. And I do this just about every night when I'm laying in bed. And I ask myself two questions. What has given me life today? And what has just sucked the life out of me? And it's a way of replaying the day and offering all that to God. But also it helps me begin to see at a deeper level the way that God has wired me. And then when I go about the day, I find myself saying, oh, this is one of those things I'm going to be grateful for this evening. And so it changes my perspective to the events that come to me. And it helps me try and see what is the unique way God has created me to live life to the full. And how can I step more into that design for my life?
Yeah. So a lot of times, we'll talk about at the center contemplative wisdom and contemplative practices. Peter's just described one of the classic contemplative practices in the contemplative Christian tradition. The other piece of that is the contemplative wisdom, which is really kind of a contemplative seeing, or maybe a kind of a roadmap, of kind of what this vision could look like. So one piece of contemplative wisdom that's been helpful to me is to think about, well, what does contemplative really mean? And at its most root, the root word of contemplative is temple. And so it helps me to begin to see, well, to be contemplative is to take seriously the teaching that Peter alluded to earlier from Paul, that you are a temple of spirit. And whether it's the Jewish tradition or other ancient temples, they had this kind of threefold aspect of the temple. So in the Jewish temple, you had the inner court, then you had the holy place, then you had the Holy of Holies, the most central inner inner chamber that Jesus talked about. So a contemplative wisdom perspective would be, well, what are the kind of practices that would kind of correlate with those parts of the temple? So part of Paul's teaching was also that we're body, soul, spirit. And so very early on, people began to correlate, well, the body is like that first entrance into the temple. So there's things of purification, there's an altar of sacrifice, there's a laver of water, where they wash. So what are the things I can do to get in my body that help put myself in a position of openness and receptivity to God? It's like I'm making this first reorientation from being just stuck in the urgent and what's just immediate right here, which is often just in our head. If we're honest with ourselves, it's like this monkey mind or this wheel that's going on in our head. So the first thing is we just got to get into our body. And so in our contemplative worship services, a lot of times we begin with some kind of body sensing practice. Get grounded in your body, sense your hand, maybe put your hands in an open receptive position with your palms up, or sense your feet on the ground. And it's very simple kinds of things, but so often we're not in our body, we're just in our mind. So we're not using all of ourselves. So we teach various kind of body sensing, body awareness practices. And then you continue to kind of follow that through. So what are the kind of soul practices that we can participate in individually or together? So in the Jewish temple, you had the menorah, the light, or the table of God's presence. And so what are the things that you chew on or nourish you that give you light? So like Lectio Divina, another ancient practice of just meditating on a short piece of scripture and maybe allowing that to be an internal commentary instead of the other toxic internal commentaries we can have running through our minds. But a breath prayer would be something that would be relevant here. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Just patterning that with your breath. And then the final one is this kind of move into the Holy of Holies, which was a secret, dark place that one had to move through a veil, which in that tradition symbolized creation. So it's a way of kind of letting go of everything and just being completely open and receptive, letting go of the thoughts and not being attached, and letting go of the feelings, because ultimately we're much more than whatever I am obsessing about right now. That's a part of me, and it's important to feel it, but to also have some kind of interior freedom within ourselves to let it go, to let it pass through, because we're more than that.
This curve is interesting. This was a graph that was shared at a call we were on last week with Houston Methodist, and I found it fascinating because, we talk about flattening the curve, right, all the time. And if you look at it, you talk about the axis that goes, what's it, the x-axis that goes up and the y-axis that goes across?
X-axis across the bottom,
across,
y-axis
and the y
is
goes
vertical.
up. Thank you very much. So the y-axis up is the health footprint of the pandemic, and the x is the time as it relates. And you can see that first sort of purple is that first wave. That's just immediate mortality of COVID-19. And you can see how it spikes. We saw this in March. It kind of goes down, although now ours is upticking back up a little bit. The second wave is the impact of resource restriction on urgent non-COVID. We see this in Houston, for example, that in Montgomery County in the month of, I can't remember if it was April or May, you had 40% increase in cardiac arrest deaths outside of the hospital. What that means is that people are not going to the hospital. So you have a curve and a decrease of the impact of the resource restriction on urgent non-COVID. Then you have chronic conditions, impact of interrupted care on chronic conditions. You look at the increase in nursing homes, in rehab centers, and all these sorts of things. So you can manage all those curves, but I found fascinating the red curve, the fourth wave they talked about, that some of the stuff I was quoting to you earlier is that we are facing now a huge psychic mental illness, economic injury, burnout, stress. There's a huge mental trauma that we are going to be confronted with. We already are now. Suicides are up. Abuse is up. Addictions is up. I mean, all of these things are up, 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 up. We have not flattened that curve. And when we start talking about the impact of a pandemic, we forget that. And to me, the mental, psychic stress, that's so related to our spiritual well-being. Don't you think?
Yeah.
Or am I just out of
No.
line here? And I think that somehow Christians especially, I know we're all in a strange place. We don't know how to make sense of all this stuff. And I'm looking for resources and answers of how to do it. And sometimes you have to be grounded in some old practices once again. Gone back and now I'm reading the Desert Fathers. Started reading some old Merton again. So there's something about it that just brings me it turns me inward more. If that makes sense.
It does.
Is that a contemplative thing?
It is.
Yeah.
Did I sound smart?
You did.
It's
a turning inward that turns you outward, though. I mean, it's a turning inward that begins to see almost like the inner aspects of all the other people and things around you. It's like when that's the thing about contemplative. Just isn't being introverted, but it's going inward so that then I can have a kind of a sympathetic relationship with the other people and things around me. I begin to relate to others in a different kind of way than if I'm just always stuck up here in the head. And these things that are happening right now are opportunities, I think, my perspective, of opening up, of breaking open the heart, of opening the soul, for us to begin to live in a way that's more natural. Some of the things that we're experiencing right now are because we've been living a way that isn't healthy or isn't natural.
Yeah, we weren't created that way.
And so, as I've been thinking about, and my family's been thinking about, what are we learning from this time? What do we want to take with us that we've learned? What do we want to discard? What do we want to keep? And I think that's part of the discernment process, at least that I'm going through right now, is what can I learn, and how can I help other people begin to reflect on this time and how it can be transformative for us.
One of the challenges is that often we view other people as mirrors, and we only see in them what we're projecting onto them, what we're reflecting back. And I know you've used the phrase quite often that we need to always test our assumptions when we interact with other people. And during this time, it's a challenge for me to really, I've got to go inside and do inner work to test some of the assumptions that I put on other human beings and the way that I'm projecting faulty lessons onto other people instead of seeing the full divinity that they're created in the image of in each person. And that's exhausting inner work. And at the same time, it has an effect in my outer world, in my relationships with other people.
So what are you guys doing? So we're teleworking a lot. I know we're doing a lot of work. You guys are still online at the center and Contemplative.
Yeah.
We're going to be doing some regathering, although I think it's going to be small groups. Y'all are going to wait a little longer for the Contemplative service. What are you doing to keep yourself sane at home?
Well, personally, I've I take seriously the whole temple body kind of image, and so part of my own discipline is exercise, nutrition kind of piece. And so I do a lot of exercise, and I find that life-giving because it gets me in my body, and it feels like it's strengthening, physically, as well as, my own soul. You just kind of feel better when you went for a run or did something. So that and being, and I think this is true of a lot of people, just being out in nature more. I've been out more in in nature since all this has happened, and felt the drive to go out more. And that's been life-giving as well. So those are two things for me that have been important is regular exercise and regularly getting out into the larger world and trying to have a kind of a communion almost with the larger world, with nature. Nature's still going on, nature's still beautiful, and I can still
some things we
resonate
talked
and
about
harmonize
before,
with that.
some things are amazingly refreshed. Like they talked about in Venice where they had jellyfish and porpoises and fish, and you could actually see in the water, and all these places that have been where people have been cleared out for a period of time. You've seen this renewal of nature. How about you? What are you keeping busy?
Couple of things for me. I'm always trying to be creative, and some of that is actually out of my desire. It's my way of processing information. And so as we've been planning worship services, Michael will often bring these very bizarre mystical texts that we're discussing, and I sit down and I try and write and encapsulate it in a way that's meaningful for me. So it's been interesting.
You mean with music?
Yes,
Yeah.
my level of music writing has actually increased during quarantine rather than decreased, partly because it's one way that I cope with new information. It's one way to fill my time, and there's less distraction for me at the house.
Yeah.
The other thing I do quite frequently, usually actually on my days off, is I will try and organize my day somewhat similar to traditional monasteries. And so if I've got a long list of cleaning and other projects around the house to do, typically I will set a timer for about 50 minutes. And then once that's done, I'll stop. The timer goes off and I'll do about 10 minutes of centering prayer. Then I'll just pick back up and carry on mopping the kitchen floor or whatever it is. And the rule for me is I must stop when the timer goes off, even if I'm just halfway through washing a plate. It helps break down the tyranny of the urgent that you talk about. And it also then, when I move from prayer back into the task, I carry that attitude with me. And so washing dishes, mopping the floor, dusting takes on a different, more spiritual meaning for me when I'm doing it because of the breaks with the prayer time.
So this is the Petrine rule of life.
Yeah.
It's a rule of life.
Yeah.
Peter Johns' rule of life.
Yeah.
Yep.
The Petrine Johannine rule of life. Set a timer. Yeah, you do cook a lot, and your
Well,
oven has been down, and
that-
you got it fixed. What today?
That
or
was
yes-
really interesting because I planned, I'm not going out, I'm not seeing that many people. So I'd planned a weekend of baking and giving away food because I'm down about 6 pounds so far. I'm working on it.
Not me, dude.
Yeah. And so then when I turned my oven on Thursday night, it just kept on getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter, and had to shut it off at the mains. And I tried to get a repairman in on Friday and just couldn't get one in. And I was in the foulest of moods all weekend.
Because your oven didn't work.
Because my oven didn't work. Because I'd planned my coping mechanism for filling time this weekend. And because of everything that's going on with the pandemic, my emotions are right on the surface anyway. And so my emotional response to that oven was way out of proportion to what it should have been. And
okay.
I had to do some serious kind of reflecting.
Everybody's been guilty of overreacting to a lot of small things lately.
Yeah.
What's been your favorite thing you've baked recently?
Baked recently. So because we're doing our service live on a Sunday morning, we don't pre-record. So I've been baking for the team on a Sunday morning, just to thank all the tech crew for coming in and being there with us. And so I made some incredibly moist brownies the other week, but I put a thin layer of chocolate Rice Krispie treat on top of the brownie. So you got this wonderful, rich crunch along with then the deep, moist chocolatiness of the brownie. And it was just so
We
good.
did offer him coffee, right? Shipping Channel coffee. He didn't bring us a brownie.
I don't drink coffee.
You drink tea, though. You got to drink
Of course,
tea.
yes.
Oh, okay, I was going to say. Wow, now I need a brownie with the crispity, crunchity,
Oh, yeah.
crunchity,
the
crispity,
flapjacks.
crunchity.
Yeah.
Well, we missed Matt Russell this week. He is with his beautiful bride. They're celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary. So they decided to just kind of get off the grid for a couple of days, which is good for him. I'm John Stevens.
Michael Sciretti, Jr.
And I'm Peter Johns.
Junior. I love how he said Junior. You know,
I've got to do
you're
that.
the only
Let's do it again.
Michael Sciretti here.
Yeah, what happens?
Now, if there was Michael Sciretti Sr. was
Yeah.
here,
Now-
then Michael Sciretti Jr.,
That's the thing, like,
that would make sense.
It's been ingrained in me, like all my life, that remember, you are a junior.
You should leave that in because that's gold.
Yeah. I think you need to do some inner contemplative work around that, Junior.
And this is Pod Have Mercy.